coming. I'm very happy to be here. Emma, that was like a fascinating talk. And I've actually been trying to practice that tradition for some time. So now I know what I'm not experiencing it. So something to look forward to. So my name is Yair Dor-Ziderman. I work in the University of Haifa. Yes, okay. I work at the University of Haifa together with the Contemplative Science and Neurophenomenology Lab headed by Aviva Berkovich-Ohana. And today what I would like to talk about is I would like to very briefly introduce self-models under time-resolved survival strategies, present a neurophysiological paradigm operationalizing early subpersonal mortality-denied processes, demonstrate that meditation, but not psychedelics, specifically ayahuasca, impacts these, and then link everything to the phenomenology of self-dissolution and argue that they have important implications for minimal phenomenal experience. So yeah, Helene already kind of put this kind of shared conceptual space, but I'll just do it very, very quickly. So it will not be, I think, most people here will kind of know this predictive processing framework. We are survival machines optimized over millions of years, no direct access to the world out there. So we have kind of brains generating simulations of it, using statistical beliefs, which can explain away the multitude of incoming sensory information, and of course constrained not by truth, but by adaptive value. And if we go back to the first statement, we can go a little bit deeper and say that the sense of someone here running the show is also created by these survival machines, because it's obviously is useful for our survival. And one more, this also was mentioned by Helene, but one step further is that this process, this subjective experience, this self-model takes on the job of its own survival and not just of the organism. And this is kind of the basic confusion which the Buddhists talk about. And this would be the direction that I would be going today. So I mentioned self-model, which was introduced by Thomas Metzinger more than 20 years ago. And actually, to me, it's more useful to think of it as in the plurality as self-models, because there are all kinds of sensory, interoceptive, autobiographical, social, narrative, all kinds of self-models. And while these are described by different people, it's not at all clear how these are kind of arranged between themselves, what is the relation between them. But one way to think about it, like in a heuristic way, would be from bodily to more abstract self-models, with the predictive horizon growing our ability to predict into the future and kind of the later developed self-models would be much extended temporally than the more bodily physiological ones. And of course, this has to do with evolution, where the more abstract self-models developing later in our evolution, appearing later during our developmental trajectory. And the thing is that this is these kind of abilities to look into the past, predict the future, read other minds. This is kind of our superpower. This makes us human, but also it has within it the inescapable conclusion that kind of at some point we're going to die. It is like a prediction that we cannot deny on an intellectual level. And also we don't know, it can happen at any time, basically. So there's really no way to kind of handle this uncertainty. So and this can create a debilitating kind of terror, paralyzing terror. So our brains create defenses to help us deal with it. Some would say that these defenses, mortality defenses, have to be in place in order for certain self-models to even kind of develop. But regardless, this kind of topic was made famous by Ernest Becker in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, and it was later implemented as an empirical paradigm by the terror management theory experimentalists. And going a step back to the self-models, because the self-models are so different from each other, it is likely that they would have different strategies for addressing, dealing with the theme of mortality. And in terror management, they usually talk about the more high-level types of processes, and these have to do with thoughts. They are slow. They're kind of a second time scale. They are personal. They are sensical. I mean, they kind of have to make sense, at least in this kind of folk psychological way. And of course, the most obvious candidates are what they call literal immortality, the idea that kind of we continue after death in one way or another. And also they talk about symbolic immortality, that somehow our great deeds, our offspring, our acts of heroism, which are sung by others, these will kind of, after we die, these will go on. And the idea is that there is a kind of a narrative, a story, and the story somehow continues. So this is on this kind of high level narrative sense. But if we look at the more kind of abstract, more bodily, more physiological, low level self-models, and here I'm taking the minimal defining features as laid out by Thomas Metzinger, which are first-person perspective, spatial temporal location, and global sense of ownership, which are the minimal defining features. Here, these are very fast. These are faster processes, have to do more with perception and sensation. They are subpersonal, and there's no. I mean, they don't have to make sense. And of course, here there's really no much. There's not a lot. There's no extension in time. So these other defenses which I talked about will not work, and we don't really know how these self-models will kind of defend themselves. And of course, it would be very good if you could kind of tie this to this to current understandings of conceptual frameworks of brain function. So this is what I set out to do in my PhD. And okay, so to begin to describe this mechanism in the tradition of Francisco Varela, we start from this phenomenological observation that while intellectually we know that at some point we are going to die, at the gut level, somehow we don't really believe it. So yeah, this is something you can look for yourself if you have this experience. But this would, and the reason for that is, and I think it was said like very nicely by Stephen Jenkinson, who used to be a palliative worker, is that everybody knows that everybody else is going to die. And if we kind of want to put it in predictive processing terms, you can talk about a high confidence prior that death relates to others, but not to ourselves. All right, so that's the idea. Just to illustrate it very simply, when stimuli which can remind us of death come into our sensory field, at the level of self-specific processing, where we kind of divide our field of experience to self and non-self, and that level therefore be categorized as something that pertains to others, but not to ourselves. Now, we hypothesize that for meditators, things would work differently, and that is because they train to make these boundaries more porous, more flexible, and even to dissolve them completely. And when this happens over time, there's really no kind of solid wall to kind of hide death behind it. And finally, if we look about people who use psychedelics for many times, in particular, for example, ayahuasca, they also have many of these non-dual ego-dissolving experiences. So possibly for them also, this mechanism would be altered. And of course, the challenge is how to implement this as a neurophysiological task. So this is a paradigm I developed together with Antoine Lutz and Avi Goldstein from Bar-Ilan. And what we did is we used the mismatch response, which is a very old, well-established paradigm, which it is an electrophysiological signal, which indexes a violation of a rule which is established by repeating sensory stimuli. And it could be any sensory stimuli, but we use the faces. So let's say you are lying inside the scanner and you see a face, and then a face again and again. So this repetition will kind of make your brain generate a prediction that this face will appear again. And when it does not appear again, when a deviant face, so this is the deviant stimuli, the repeating faces are the standard stimuli, about 300 milliseconds after the onset of the deviant face, you will see this kind of higher wave. And if that's a mismatch response. And if we divide the white from the red line, basically that's how we quantify it. Okay, one step further. Let's say I am the participant and I'm seeing my face, right? Once, twice, three times, and then the deviant face. So in this case, we're going to see the same response, only larger. And the reason for that is because our brains are kind of egoistic, and we know that of the self-advantage effect, that the brain prioritizes and allots more resources to self-relevant information. It's a very well-established effect across memory and cognition and the brain. All right. Finally, to this we added a context. And so before this, each sequence of faces, there was a word appearing above. It could be a death-related word, a negative-related word, yeah, not very pleasant words, but also death-related words. And of course, and we match these list of words for valence and arousal and frequency in the language and and many other things. So the difference is the context. Is it death-related or just merely negative? So we end up with this kind of very classical 2x2 paradigm with one factor of identity, self, other, priming, negative, or death. And our condition of interest was this condition which put together death and self-related information. And here we hypothesized that there would be reduced self-prioritization under existential threat, a smaller VMMR. And the reason for that would be, we thought would be because the brain would somehow deem this combination unreliable, so no prediction would be generated, and therefore no prediction error, or a smaller one. That's the idea. And of course, the meditators, we assume it would be different, that we would see this normal mismatch response effect. Okay, so that's the paradigm. And we used an MEG machine, which measures kind of the magnetic signal, and it has a very good time resolution, so it's kind of fitting to the paradigm. So yeah, so let me walk you through the results. So this is like part of the original study findings. So if we look at all conditions together, around between 250 and 300 milliseconds post-stimuli, we see this effect. So the red, the deviant, is higher than the standard stimuli. And it's localized left posterior central kind of electrodes. And when we kind of subtract the blue from the red line, the standard from the deviant, and we collapse it to the 4 different conditions, we see something, I think, very interesting. And that is, in the 3 control conditions, we see the expected visual mismatch response effect, but in the death self DS, the condition combining death and self, we see there is no signal. And actually, we can show it's a true null effect using kind of Bayesian statistics. So the condition combining death and self-related information, something, I mean, actually more than we predicted. We found no prediction error, basically. And yeah, for people who kind of work in neuroscience, this is a very strange finding. That's very kind of low level of signal would be basically obliterated with just one word or another kind of being in the context of yeah. So all right, and so this was kind of, there was some other results, but yeah, I don't have time to go into it today. And I will move to the meditators. So a couple of years later, we brought 38 meditators to the lab, and we basically replicated the effect in terms of time and more or less kind of the spatial location. But when we look at these 4, when we break it down into the 4 different conditions, we see something very interesting. I mean, it's almost a mirror image of the non-meditator's results. And here, actually, the death self condition looks like it's the largest. So clearly, something very radically different is happening in the brains of the meditators. And if we will kind of look at these results a little bit more closely, and statistically, what we see is that we have kind of what we call a main effect of identity, which means that the death self and negative self should be treated as one condition, death other and negative other should be considered as one condition. So the priming effect was not significant here. And really what we are seeing is what we talked about before, the self-advantage effect, that self is larger than other, the self-prioritization. And if we do some source localization, we also see that there's no difference between the death self and negative self conditions. And that kind of leads me to the conclusion that meditators' brains do not react towards death as a uniquely aversive category, which kind of needs this really strict control measures to be in place. I mean, the precision death negative is the same, and we call it, just for simplicity's sake, we will call this death acceptance. All right, so the next thing we did was subtract the other from the self condition, kind of to quantify the effect. And if we plot it against reported well-being, we see that the less self-prioritization we see, the more they tend to report higher well-being, which is kind of in line with some other studies, in particular a study by Matisse Stratwine and some others, and it kind of fits with the general framework outlined by Namun and Ricard that the selfless mind is happier than the selfless mind. All right, so this is some of the data on the meditators. And now let's move to the ayahuasca participants. So here we had quite a large sample, same paradigm, and again we had the same effect. We replicated the effect in time. Here we also found a right cluster in addition to the left posterior cluster. But still, if you look at in both of these clusters, it's very clear that here again, the death self-condition is not significant, no significant prediction error. And we compare it to the data I showed you before, it's very clear. I mean, you can see very clearly that the meditators are not like the same as the ayahuasca participants. They are like the non-meditated, like the control population. And just to kind of maybe make that a little bit more quantified, I mean, these are different data sets, but if we take the left cluster, which appeared in all of them, and we kind of normalize it so we only maintain information of the relation between the different conditions for each group, and we can put that all into kind of a mixed ANOVA, and we have found a very robust interaction effect. And you can see here visually that the ayahuasca control, the distribution of condition is the same. The meditator is very, very different. And if we go for each condition differently and compare the three groups, meditators, ayahuasca, and the controls, we only found a significant difference in the death self condition. And here the meditators have, like I said, have a larger VMMR effect than the other two. And the point of this slide is just to say the differences between the groups are specific to the death self condition. Only when death and self are coupled, this is when something changed somewhere, something happened. This is where the action is, which is exactly kind of the point of the whole paradigm. All right, so what can we learn from these data? Quickly, one is that self-specific prediction-based neural mechanism maintain the coherency of low-level self-models by categorizing death as information relating to the other or non-self. We know that these defensive processes can radically change. We saw that for the meditators. And we can also, I think, conclude that these self or ego dissolution experience per se are not sufficient condition. They cannot explain, because both groups have a lot of these experiences. And also we can possibly say that also these high-level mortality defenses also cannot explain this low-level mortality defenses. And I will kind of stay with that for one more minute. Oh, okay, wow, all right. We also get into this question, the participants, when the heart and brain stops working, the soul conscious either terminally ends or continues after death, and they also had to say how certain they were. And we see that for meditators, they had median of 80% certainty in the continuation. So possibly you can say, okay, this is what kind of licenses and allow them to let go of these lower level defensive processes. But ayahuasca people were also very sure of their continuation, and so this cannot explain the difference between the groups. All right, and this is finally I want to go back to the meditators and kind of tie all this to minimal phenomenal experience. And the reason we can do this is because we have this very long project with these same meditators studying the self boundaries. Also Emma mentioned this. And I think Matisse presented this data 2 years ago in detail. And this is Ohad, who is the phenomenologist. And very, very quickly, we had these meditators go a self-boundary dissolution training. We had micro-phenomenological interviews with all the rigorous analysis procedure. And we came up with these different categories: agency, location, first-person perspective, attention, body sensations, affective valence. And these experiential categories, one thing we were able to do was not just kind of delineate them, but also kind of rank them in an ordinal fashion. And this allows looking for a relation between them and also between them and external data. And before and one thing I just want to point out that this phenomenal self-model, the minimal defining features, kind of match very nicely to these three categories on the left, almost perfectly. And the thing is, when these minimal defining subjective features are let go of, this is where MPE, many phenomenal experience, emerges. And the point is that this, I think, shows that this paradigm is a good paradigm for kind of charting the transition into the MPE state. So these 5 categories kind of marked this dissolution depth, and they were very highly correlated and also correlated with meditation experience. But affective valence, how blissful to terrible these states were, was orthogonal, which was a very interesting finding to us. There was no correlation between them. They did not predict it. And when we were writing the discussion to that paper, what we hypothesized was this could be related to what is called in Buddhist tradition bhavatana, the craving for existence, the fear of non-being. So basically, these kind of low-level self-model kind of really holding on to existence, holding on to the remnants of the subjectivity, and the fear of letting that go. And actually, this is what we found. When we plot the valence during self-boundary dissolution, which I showed you before, so if you move to the right, it becomes more positive. Against this kind of a neural, what we call death acceptance index, we see that positively balanced self-dissolution experiences predicted what we call the death acceptance. So we have this relation between MPE and these kind of low-level mortality defenses processes. And I think it's kind of useful because maybe possibly that people who experience fear during self-dissolution, and we know today from the literature that this is actually a common experience for meditators. And this could be indicative of these kind of low-level death denial processes which are taking place. And on the other hand, it's also possible that meditation into dissolution practices which kind of feel good may lead to kind of train this kind of low-level self-models in death acceptance. And actually, there are some traditions, in particular karmakajic traditions, which kind of go into these self-dissolution states out of a state of bliss. And this is something which today makes a lot of sense to me. And of course, to establish causation, we will have to do further experiments. And probably over time. So this is the last slide. And the proposition I would like to leave you with is that this meditative path towards MPE, it's possible that it has to kind of pass through this kind of acceptance, of very deep acceptance, or working with these kind of low-level self-models and teaching them to kind of basically convincing them that they are mortal. And this is something which is very well recognized in Buddhist tradition. It goes back to the mythology of Buddhism, where Prince Siddhartha sets on his spiritual path after encountering death, a dead person, and goes through all these mindfulness of death practices. Some of them are which people actually go sit in front of dead bodies, go to graveyards and charnel grounds, and really kind of work pretty hard to really bring this in as an embodied experience, to really break through these defenses. And on the other hand, this is something that we do not find, I think, almost at all in kind of this modern manifestation of mindfulness and even meditation in many traditions. Somehow this gets, I think, a little bit ignored. But I think that as we, as scientists, building on this Buddhist knowledge, but we develop our own meditative traditions, own contemplative tradition, which some discussions I've had with people looks like they may be a little bit different from the traditional ones, incorporating scientific ideas into it. And as we develop this, hopefully this kind of information can be incorporated and would be useful. Yeah, right. So that's what I wanted to share today. I want to thank my friends and colleagues, ChatGPT, for helping me generate images. And I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you.